call to order this regularly scheduled meeting, the Community Development Committee for the Metropolitan Council for July 1st, 2024. I am the chair of this committee, Councilmember Robert Lilligren, joined by a quorum of the committee. So thank you, council members, for being here so promptly on this holiday weekend. And we can move right into our agenda. It's a very informative agenda. We have 2 information items. Looking forward to hearing the brief updates. So if there are no objections, I'll consider the agenda approved for today. Great, we have an agenda. And next is the approval of the June 17, 2024 Community Development Committee minutes. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Thank you, Councilmember Chambliss. A second?
Second.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf. Any discussion, additions, corrections? Hearing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. We'll move into the body of our agenda, which is 2 information items. Very much looking forward to both of them and some conversation and discussion. And so we will start with the regular update on the work of the American Indian Advisory Council. And we're joined by Allison Waka, who's helping lead this work, and Director Torres, who is doing it as well. And so welcome, Ms. Waka, Ms. Torres. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, council member, and I appreciate the promotion that you just gave me.
Oh, what did I do? Sorry. You're welcome. So will you say your title for me?
Of course, yes. I'm Angela Torres, the Senior Manager of Local Planning Assistance.
Manager.
Yes, thank you, and I know that you're all very well familiar with me. It's good to see you again. Looking forward to this update, and I'll just ask Allison to introduce herself.
Hi, Allison Waka, Tribal Liaison and Native Relations Coordinator.
I know you like to introduce your
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if we're doing the.
No, you go ahead.
My clans are Tatanasani and Awasa, and I always would like to acknowledge my parents, Mary Alice Sosi and Lawrence Waka, and really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's not.
So as Chair Lilligren mentioned, this is a regular update. This is our second time in front of you. So I just wanted to always kind of ground us as to where we are and the council value and regional goal as to what is driving and directing this work. Our region is equitable and inclusive. This regional goal was endorsed in January of this year. And so I just want to make sure that that leads this work. So this is an overview of the meeting series of the Advisory Council. We have been reviewing key policy areas of Imagine 2050 and developing recommended actions for each one, as well as actions for the Met Council overall, talking about organizational change. Our next meeting is on July 8th, and it will be spent in review of recommendation statements in preparation for the last meeting on July 22nd, where we've invited Regional Administrator Ryan O'Connor and Chair Zelli to review recommendations with the Advisory Council members before the presentation to the full council, the Committee of the Whole meeting in August. I wanted to just do a quick reminder. We presented to you about this work last on May 6th, and we recapped the first 3 meetings of the Advisory Council, talking first about the land acknowledgement process, a Met Council overview, and the parks policy. Next, we'll review the progress since then, talking about the 4 meetings that have happened since May with policy staff from Environmental Services, the Environmental Justice Task Force members, Transportation, and Housing. I should also mention that our operations partners in Metro Transit and the Metro HRA also accompanied the policy and planning staff to integrate and support those conversations. And Advisory Council members, again, will be presenting the final recommendations to the Council at the August 21st Committee of the Whole. What we've done is prepared reflections from each of the 4 meetings that we've had since we were here last. I'll talk just a little bit about the policy side of things, and Allison will talk about the recommended actions and some of the conversation that happened as part of of the work in each meeting. So when we were with the environmental services staff on May 13th, we were really digging into water policy. Some of the initial feedback was really recognizing how siloed water policy is among different agencies. Looking at existing funding sources and requirements that really entrench those silos and it makes change very difficult. However, there was a good recognition that enshrining the rights of water really aligns with the indigenous approach to water, and there was a really robust conversation. So, I don't know, Allison, if you want to talk about any of the recommended actions?
Yeah, with this meeting, the biggest takeaway, I think, was the recommendation that Met Council works closely with the DNR and other institutions to really, what Angela stated, it's really siloed. And it just really needs to have more of a cohesive, so we're all working on the same things. And it seems that when it's wasted time and energy a lot of times. And so things are happening all at different pockets. And so the recommendation that came forward was more of communication across different agencies for this, with the prioritizing the indigenous viewpoint of water being a relative.
Thanks, Allison.
Yeah.
We had a virtual meeting talking about environmental justice. It's the only virtual meeting we've had, just like as an aside. It went really well. On May 28th meeting, we really looked into the future as a priority, constantly new projects that can create new injustices. Metrics and data are really important, and it will also support relationships of accountability for the council, which is really important, and I know that that's one of our regional values as well. There is a continual conversation about the need for recognition of genocide, shaping policy perspectives, really recognizing the historical context of the region.
My biggest takeaway from this was that the advisory council was really thankful that this work is happening within the council. We had really great discussions, even it being a virtual meeting. And so they were grateful that this work was happening and that Indigenous voices are included. With this, I think they would like to see more staff being led with an environmental justice viewpoint. So just more of a professional development with environmental justice.
On June 10th, we invited not only staff, Charles Carlson, the Executive Director of Metropolitan Transportation Services, but also staff from Metro Transit to join the Advisory Council. Just recognizing that whenever you're talking about a subject, inevitably you'll talk about operations, not just policy. So we understand policy is like this written document and these are the directions that we're taking, but people really talk about it as to how they use a system and how they interact with the transportation system within their communities. And so we wanted to make sure and bridge that connection. The conversation around transportation was that tribal engagement really varies significantly across jurisdictions. The liaison approach has really worked well, so they're very supportive of that. And actually, I've heard several times throughout our conversations that we really need to broaden that approach because there are so many intersections across the council where there are interactions with not only urban Indian organizations, but actual tribal nations as well. So really wanting to create a sense of place through art and language at transit stops. The Twin Cities is a hub for Indigenous culture, and we should think about how the transportation system can support cultural resources.
With this was one of our more engaging meetings as far as having both transit and transportation there, just having the two different viewpoints. And Charles was wonderful in leading the examples on how policy can really work and intertwined with community engagement. So one of the leading recommendations I believe will come out of this meeting will be having a Native representative from all 7 counties, like one from every county here at Met Council. And so I just thought that was an amazing idea. And a lot of folks sometimes think that, the suburbs don't have natives, but they do. And so this just seemed like a really great idea to bring forward, especially with transportation and transit. I think that we struggle a lot of times with being able to use it, and also it being part of a lot of our relatives are unsheltered, and then it does create somewhat of how do we support each other in using transit, and learning more about what transportation and that division we can work with them to do things better. So I really like the idea of having this representatives from all 7 counties. I thought that was an amazing takeaway.
And if I can note, before you go on to the next slide, please, in conversation with some of the advisory council members, this transportation session was really a highlight. They all called it out. I was kind of surprised. It isn't where I thought people's interests would really go. Yeah. But they were into it, man, I'll tell you.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on to the last one. So from June 24th, we had our housing staff join the advisory council, as well as Terry Smith, the Metro HRA director. And the unsheltered and homeless conversation continued as we were talking with the advisory council on housing policy, recognizing that homelessness should not exist in the Indigenous community living on their own homelands. The high homeless rates really reflect the systemic injustices and generational trauma from genocide and displacement. We've talked a lot about anti-displacement through some of our transit projects, and we have an anti-displacement framework, but that needs to come with a recognition that displacement happened a very long time ago when the Indigenous communities were through genocide and displacement removed from their homelands. And so a little bit of context around that is necessary as well. Also really highlighted was being able to live near centers of community life is especially important. Community connections has been a thread of conversation across many communities as we're talking about the regional development guide. And of course, it came up again in this conversation as well. Housing services should really be provided by Indigenous organizations that know the community was another suggestion for housing policy staff.
This was the one meeting that funding really came up as a question, and wanting to engage more and learn more about how that works and how Native organizations that are doing the work. It has been shown to be more successful in the Native community when Native organizations are funded to then help the Native community. So how can we reduce the barriers and really make that the most effective use of funding?
And this is our last slide. We know too, through the work of the advisory council, we've been working with them for months now. And after each one, we're talking with our different policy teams. Obviously, the policy teams themselves are bringing back the conversations into the policy work themselves. But there's a lot of other ongoing internal conversations. We don't need to wait for regional policy to be adopted. We have decisions that are being made and discussions that are happening right now. And so we do know that some things are happening already. We know that there was a conversation about funding for specific specific areas like regional parks, how we've talked on an ongoing basis, and we know that in environmental services, they're hiring additional Indigenous and tribal engagement staff. And then we've also talked at this committee and at other places about structural agreements, maybe not memorandum of understanding, but some sort of contractual agreement to support American Indian organizations. And through the integration team and other policy leads, we've been talking already about how we can take the recommendations and the initial comments from the advisory council and integrate them into the regional policy that you are all reviewing already. So with that, then Allison and I are here to take any comments, to answer any questions that we might be able to ask, and take anything back to the advisory council that you may have as
Yeah,
well.
thank you, Ms. Walcott, Senior Manager Torres. I appreciate it. Discussions, questions, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thanks. Very helpful presentation. I'm curious about the water policy conversation that you had. Especially the first bullet under the recommended actions. Which is
To-
actively advocate for structural changes needed to institutionalize new approaches to water across sector. And I'm curious if you could expand upon what that means. Is that more of a one water approach, looking at wastewater and groundwater and surface water, or what sort of institutional new approaches did you folks discuss?
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee members, yes, that was absolutely part of it. They really appreciated the one water approach. It is consistent with a Native perspective, but also really broadening the understanding that water is seen as a relative and sharing that understanding across the other state agencies. We talked quite a lot about the challenges of a coordinated water approach just because of the different state and regional regulatory authorities being distributed to different agencies for different purposes, and how over time that has created some siloed effects, which I don't think is a surprise for anyone, but really changing that would take a systematic approach and isn't something that we could do alone, but through partnership with others. But really thinking about water as in a different way, I think is something that they wanted us to really carry forward, speaking on behalf of them in other spaces where we do have responsibilities. Allison, I don't know if you wanted to add anything? Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Councilmember Lindstrom, and thanks for introducing me to a term I hadn't heard before, the one water approach. I'm already Googling like crazy here. And yeah, I would just note that water is such an incredible activating tool for Native people, and whether it's renaming a lake, Pademakaska, or projects like Owomni Omni Akudeapi at the falls in Minneapolis, or Wakan Tipi, Awanyan Kapi here in St. Paul. It really galvanizes Native people's attention and action. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, to follow up on Councilmember Lindstrom, MOSAC has been working on integrating the work of the different state agencies, and the planning is now actually happening together, which is a good change. So that's been something that's been worked on for the past couple of years at MOSAC, trying to get everybody pulling in the same direction instead of at cross purposes. My question is on slide 5, the first bulleted thing there about there are constantly new projects that can create new injustices. Do you have an example of a project that created a new injustice?
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee members, I wasn't at that meeting, but in reflection, I do know that the Hastings Water Treatment Plant project has come up several times where our own policies weren't really followed to the best of our ability, and consultation wasn't happening. And so that creates an injustice when you're not consulted on something that impacts sacred sites, impacts really sensitive areas that are cultural and important spaces for your community. So that's a current example. The relationship, I think, is really going in the right direction. When we were having the water policy conversation, it went so well. It was the only group that was asked to come back. We would like you to come back. We want to have more conversation about this. I really enjoyed the water conversation. I wasn't at the transportation one, so maybe that one was even better. I don't know, but the water conversation was really deep and rich, and a lot of shared stories around what water means for people individually. The naming is really important, and we had some conversation around that as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Further discussion, Councilmember Dolkar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a process clarification question. So will all of the recommendations go to committee of the whole, and then the council has to deliberate on the recommended action? Will every one of them be considered?
Chair and
Torres.
committee members, thank you, council member, for asking that question. That's the intention. The intention is for, at the committee of the whole, all of the recommendations that have been developed over these past months with the advisory council will be presented by advisory council members to the committee of the whole at that meeting. The chair and regional administrator are coming to the meeting right before that, so they will have a preview, and we will be talking through some of those things with them earlier. But the council will be the one that, the policymakers obviously are the ones that consider which recommendations will end up in regional policy. But the recommendations are meant as public comment and to the regional development guide at large, in the same way that any other group would be bringing forward public comment. They are done in concert with council partnership, though, so it is a little bit different, but will be considered in that same scope along the line.
Yeah, Councilmember Dolkar.
I'm going to do a follow-up. So this is coming from a place of curiosity, and then I'm just going to say I'm personally very supportive. I would like to see all recommended action sounds great, but I think the two that I really, really would like to see move faster or sooner in partnership with communities is one, underwater, sort of the naming of the waterways. I feel like that's an easy, thing to do. Well, it will take time because you have to do work with the communities, but I think that feels like a very common sense approach and something that we could take on. And I do know that at the United Nations and globally, there is an effort and a movement towards naming the rights of the nature. And I think that's probably outside of Met Council's jurisdiction, but I think just naming the waterways through indigenous lens, I think, or naming or going back to their original name makes sense. The second one that I'm sort of curious about how it will land and what it means, because we have had the early discussion this year, is around project-based voucher program and the recommendations around housing and what that partnership looks like with Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, City of Minneapolis, or City of St. Paul, and scaling up sort of indigenous, nonprofit-led, community-owned affordable housing, and what tools and policies and financing options we have as a council to really support that sort of scaling up.
Comment, Ms. Torres? No?
Chair and council members, I don't have an answer to that. I do know, I just want to reiterate that the Metro HRA Director, Terry Smith, was at that meeting, and we did have a conversation about vouchers and not only the selection process, but the awarding process and the potential, because of some of the existing programs that have been either are in place now or have been done in the past or could happen in the future. There's all kinds of opportunities to shape some of that work. I won't speak on her behalf as to what that might look like, because I don't know, but that was very much a part of the conversation. It was a very rich conversation as well. We had some Indigenous housing experts that were a part of that conversation as well. So we were at Undayang Center, and so we had some guests at that meeting as well.
Comment from Director Barajas?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. In addition to what Angela said, you might recall that we are expecting to get roughly 1,000 vouchers from the state rent assistance program. And those are sort of open, actually, they are open for the council to determine on how to use them, whether they're project-based or tenant-based vouchers. We're still waiting for some program guide things, but there certainly will be conversations that Terry and the team will be bringing here to this body for your direction on how you want to prioritize or direct the use of those resources.
And I would note that's a conversation that's going to happen imminently, right? As soon as we have
As soon as we know.
guidance, right? And that I would just note, and this is a much broader kind of policy conversation, but I'm sure in due time we can get there. But our authorities around our HRA extend beyond vouchers, right? And so there's other conversations we can have within that framework. So just to note that. Further discussion, Councilmember Lindstrom.
Yeah, I'm just curious on the renaming the Dakota names or reclaiming the Dakota names for water bodies. Is there a source where if a person wanted to learn what the Dakota name is for a particular water body in our region or across the state, where would a person go to find that information?
Ms. Walko.
Yeah, I think, sorry, thank you for the question. I do have a couple resources just in my own personal files. But the one thing that I know offhand would be the Marlena Miles, her Twin Cities Dakota map. There are, I believe the U does have Dakota linguists that do work on those and have records. It would just take a little digging up, but I don't know offhand if there's anything on the internet just in a simple search that would be, I think that would take some Dakota elders and first speakers to come together in agreement of some of those things, but it's definitely doable and something that we could. Marlena Miles was one of the artists that designed the We Are on Dakota Land.
The bus wrap.
Yep. So this would be a wonderful opportunity to engage with art as well and kind of incorporating that and so maybe supporting her work with that. She does work with a linguist named Dawi who is learning, well, he's fluent in Dakota. And so, but I do think that we could lead that with the Dakota community here. It would take some conversations though.
Sounds like it'd be a big project.
Yeah,
Very
but it's,
interesting one
I
for
don't
somebody.
feel like it would be overwhelming by any means, but it would be in a respectful way to do that.
Ms. Walker, if you don't mind sharing some of those resources.
Oh,
with
yeah,
Committee members.
definitely,
and
yes.
The Marlena Miles map is kind of held up as, it's very well researched. Like Ms. Walker said, there's never going to be 100% agreement on names, but she is definitely an authority on that. And, yeah, cool. Further discussion, Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. On page 8, the ongoing conversations, if there are ways that we can, support you, more explicitly, whether that's, I don't know if that means like approving MOUs or if you have to name specific resources you need, like in the upcoming budget that we have to vote on, I think that's a great way to remind us when those steps come up so that we can help you.
Ms. Torres.
Chair and Committee Member Lee, thank you so much for mentioning that and offering support. Yes, you'll be seeing various actions all along the way. I will defer to Director Barajas if she wants to talk about budget conversations. That's not my bailiwick, but there will be periodic places where decision points will be made. Part of that is the Regional Development Guide, but you deal with contracts and you deal with budgets all the time. And so when you're thinking about staffing, when you're thinking about planning for next year and how we're thinking about community-centered engagement as part of our equity framework, there's a lot of ways that we can implement this work. And obviously, your support along the way is appreciated.
Well, and Councilmember Lee, I would know under Councilmember Dolkar's leadership, that she's convened a group that's already kind of exploring ways of moving forward with sort of in the direction you were talking about. So if there are things that could even be done within the 2025 budget conversation and framework. And so it's exploratory, but I do thank Councilmember Dolkar for her leadership in this area. Further discussion on this excellent report. Great work. Thanks for the succinct and terse report, and look forward to what comes forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And committee members, we'll move on to our final agenda item for today. I see Director Barajas is moving around. So this is our density analysis with recommendations. This will be led by Director Barajas and Senior Manager Torres.
Thank you, Chair.
Who starts? Lisa?
Good afternoon.
Good
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. My pleasure to be here this afternoon. It's not often I'm on this side of the table, so excuse me if I'm a little bumpy. So today we're going to be talking about density policies, which you have seen before in front of this committee, at committee of the whole, and other conversations. As we walk through some of the density approaches that are under consideration, we're really looking for your direction on these approaches. At a high level, do you have any questions about the approaches that are presented? Are there areas we can clarify or better explain? And do these approaches advance regional goals? So, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about density along with the findings and recommendations of some of the analysis that the council completed to help guide the density conversation. First, though, we need to ground everyone in the considerations that went into the recommendations. That includes the regional goals for 2050, the scenarios analysis findings, and some of the qualitative engagement findings. Just to show that we've had a lot of conversations around this map, this particular chart is quite large, and while we may not have talked about or labeled or titled our presentation or discussion density, we really have been talking about these approaches since the get-go as part of our land use objectives and the direction that we're working from your direction to develop in those objectives that really show regional goals as a part of land use and how we carry those out. Most recently, we've also had recent meetings with the Regional Planning and Advisory Group, which are folks who are city representatives, staff, community development directors, city administrators that are convened in partnership with Metro Cities to discuss all things regional planning, but in particular on December 5th, a discussion of draft land use objectives, and then on February 6th, most recently, presented density analysis and approaches. And then again, I believe just last week, a Tuesday, right? So continuing that conversation with this group. But before we get into that, I just want to ground us in the why. Why are we considering the approaches that we have in front of us? These goals should not be foreign to you, but just wanted to remind you of these 5 goals about advancing our region as an equitable and inclusive place, that our communities are healthy and safe, that our region is dynamic and resilient, that we lead on addressing climate change, in particular mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to our changing environment, and that we're protecting and restoring natural systems. I've been here a long time. Natural resource management was my concentration in my master's degree program, so it's just wants to come out that way every time, but in natural systems. This is really important as we're thinking about how we best advance these goals and how our policies in land use can change in order to do that work and to best advance these goals. As we've gone through in the scenarios planning analysis, you may recall that we're really testing out how these different scenarios, high growth and compact versus low growth, compact or dispersed and vice versa, how our goals are advanced or impacted by these different types of growth scenarios. Compact versus dispersed is probably the most focused part of the land use conversation. And as we were going through this work and really thinking about it, you may recall the number of times we brought various analyses and findings for you, whether it was on land use or climate change, water impacts, transportation impacts, so that we could get a good sense of in what way are our policy, or what policies are needed to achieve these goals, and if we can't achieve our goals, how might we mitigate for those goals under different policy approaches? So as a result of all of that work, we're finding within the compact scenarios that the council is best able to advance regional goals. We find that, I think probably at its simplest form, that a compact scenario has the most efficient use of land, including agricultural land protection, that we're more likely to have lower greenhouse gas emissions regardless of being a high growth or low growth scenario. And that's a total emissions, both in transportation and in residential building or commercial, the energy use that goes into the built form. Then we have higher job accessibility because people live closer to things. There's higher viability for transit as well. We do need certain densities in order for transit to be cost effective and efficient. That we have a lower cost of meeting affordable housing need. Using less land is a key component of that. There's less chloride runoff, more efficient use of our wastewater infrastructure, lower risk of environmental degradation. And not to say that we still can't have impacts within a compact environment, but the degradation associated with a much broader footprint across the landscape can be harder to mitigate for than in a more compact environment, especially around the last point around fragmentation of the natural systems themselves. In dispersed scenarios, we find that we do have a lower risk of displacement and gentrification, and there's less nitrate runoff. But those are things that impacts that we see in compact scenarios that we feel like can be mitigated for. The list on both sides of this slide clearly show different outcomes in that regard. Then as we go into our density analysis that goes along with this work, as we dig a little bit deeper into the numbers, we just want to start with first that a lot of great things are already happening. Communities have been really doing the work over the last several years. You might recall this slide or not from our compact composite. I know it was several years ago now at this point, but with the analysis we did of our of how communities were planning in the 2040 comprehensive plans. This slide shows the darker blue bar shows what the average plan density for communities were in the 2030 round of comprehensive plans, and the light blue bar to the right shows the average densities across communities within that community designation in their 2040 comprehensive plans. The white number that is on each of those bars going down shows what our minimum density for the 2040 comprehensive planning cycle was. So you can see that communities, while we were planning in urban center requiring minimum density of 20 units an acre, on average, communities were exceeding 50 units an acre overall across their 2040 regional plans for urban centers. And that it carries out through urban, suburban edge, and so on, where our minimum densities are lower and communities are planning for just above those across the board. We also find that market conditions continue to support higher densities across all community types, and communities have been responding to greater housing needs in their plans and in comprehensive plan amendments. You may recall from our plan amendment analysis each year where we share the types of amendments that we're hearing, and is the big ones that come across your for your review and action often are ones that are for increased density to support a development proposal. But planning does have long-term impacts, and while we have had a lot of success in our plans for this last cycle in particular, a lot of our landscape that we have today will be with us for decades to come. It's already been on the ground for decades, and it will be with us for decades to come. So there are these long-term impacts to these patterns of development, and past decisions impact both what is happening now and what we are planning for in the future. Incremental changes aren't enough to meet our long-term needs. There is a gap between the minimum density requirements and actual development because of those long-term patterns. Low-density land use patterns do impact our infrastructure investments, and business as usual doesn't help us be as effective at achieving regional goals. Say there's one thing that a LUAC member said one time, and that probably last year, or the year before, that's really stuck with me, is that the decisions we make about how we first develop our communities are essentially our destiny. I'm totally paraphrasing right now, but that those decisions we make about how we lay out our communities and what that first development pattern looks like kind of locks us into where we're going to be. That not meant to be defeatist, but meant to more be, it's hard to change the patterns that we have already on the ground today, and it takes a lot of work. So when we think about what we're going to do going forward, it does ask us to do more than just incremental change. But before we get into it, I also want to share some analysis, some qualitative analysis of the engagement work that was completed for Imagine 2050. It reflects people's desires and needs for their communities. And looking at feedback specifically related to conversations where we heard about development patterns, development overall, density, and local needs, we heard that there is an understanding that more dense housing can further goals around preserving natural systems and biodiversity and green spaces. Needs of individual housing units are to accommodate larger families, multi-generational families, and affordability impacts the ability for people to have the housing needs for their families. We also heard that people want better transit, improved bike ped safety, walkable communities with dense and mixed-use development within urban and suburban communities. That was shared across the board from folks that we were able to engage with. And there's an understanding that a walkable city is good for reducing the carbon footprint of the city. It increases transportation or transit use, and walkability is actually good for the health of citizens and residents alike. So the analysis that we shared with you, I won't walk through all of it today, but really want to walk through these takeaways before we move into our recommended approaches. From this analysis, we have found the following: that despite higher density ranges developed in that past decade, overall the developed densities within our community still remains below that planned minimum density. That's accounting for everything that's on the ground today. Higher developed densities in the recent decade are insufficient to bring the overall density of development up to that minimum planned density across the board. And despite some communities building at higher densities, very low densities are still being developed in other communities within that same community designation. Recent development trends in suburban edge communities are consistent with the planned 2040 densities. And overall density in emerging suburban edge communities is lower than the minimum requirements. So platted density is higher than developed density, suggesting that many plats remain undeveloped. You might remember when Mackenzie was here at our last meeting to talk about plat monitoring and where we're seeing trends there, especially on that lot absorptions. We know there's still some to come. They're not all built out yet, but still we are overall still seeing that our built form overall isn't in the right place to help us best advance our regional goals. So at this point, I will turn to Angela.
Sure.
Thank you.
So from the density report, which we shared in May when we were talking about the 60% plan, and we've walked through with the Regional Development Guide Working Group and others, we did have a set of recommended density approaches. Those are on the slide here. Some are policy decisions and some are administrative practices and guidelines which implement the policy. So increasing minimum density requirements, thinking differently about how we expand MUSA, establishing criteria for when and how that occurs, establishing minimum density requirements for all new connections to the regional sewer system, and evaluating the feasibility of demand and development of land uses based on practicality are 4 of the proposed density policies. I want to address the asterisk on, that's always a word, right? Asterisk on the third policy of establishing a minimum density requirement for all new connections to the regional sewer system. Through conversations with the RDG working group, with our council members in that group, we have heard some concerns about how that might be implemented. We'll talk more about that at a later slide, but I just want to say that that one may not move forward just based on concerns about implementation and how that might actually impact how we calculate density. We don't want to inadvertently have unintended consequences, and so we'll talk about that in a future slide. Administrative practices and guidelines. That we're proposing is to consider all land guided to support growth, not just areas of change, which is the current practice, to calculate density requirements per decade rather than over the planning horizon, which is current practice, and to use a performance-based approach to explore flexibility in minimum planning requirements while advancing regional goals. So I want to walk through each one of these in a little bit more in depth so that we can pause when you have questions and talk about it and the implications of it in a little bit more detail. So we'll have this discussion. So when we're talking about a policy recommendation to increase minimum density requirements, we know several things. This encourages communities to plan for higher density, more compact development, better advances regional goals. Over time, that density of development increases, which helps compensate for existing lower density areas within communities, contributes to lowering greenhouse gas emissions, and helps meet the state's new GHG reduction goals, targets, and regional goals. This has to be paired, so I want to be clear about the approach to implementation. This proposal really does need to be paired with accompanying measures to meet minimum density requirements within specific timeframes, to pair that with incentives, and to define areas of flexibility. We always have flexibility with how we're building out the how we implement regional policy, and so we will work with local governments to define what that looks like and to provide and to receive their feedback on what they would actually need, areas where flexibility might be best applied. So here we are sharing the existing, average, and recommended minimum net density by community designation. I just want to be clear, I know that the table shows under Thrive that suburban edge and emerging suburban edge are grouped into one cell. The analysis for community designations isn't kind of a one-for-one. We didn't just simply combine them. There was an analysis done to do that, but this was the closest kind of visual representation that we could share so that there was a clear understanding. The average planned density on this slide shows the average for communities as they're grouped under Imagine 2050 community designations. You'll note that Thrive designations there were 5 urban service area designations, and we're now in Imagine 2050 only proposing 4 designations. So based on the community designation work, which we'll show in maps on the following slides, we calculated the average planned minimum densities for communities within the 2050 designations. I also want to remind you too that increasing minimum density doesn't mean that we are asking communities to accommodate more growth. We're asking communities for that forecasted growth to be planned more efficiently. It isn't about development of a certain number of units, but really about efficiency of land available for growth and thus efficient use of the regional wastewater system as well. So density alone, we know, can't solve everything, but this is part of the solution to many of the regional goals. Increasing density can be met through a variety of different ways: infill, redevelopment, and new development, depending on where communities are in the region. And we know that this has broad implications, but want to hear from you what considerations you may have as you think about what implementation might look like. And I do want to pause here, since I know this will generate some feedback. If you want, I can go through the next 2 slides, which really talk about community designations, and that ties in with the minimum density requirements. But I know that this in particular will be an area of discussion.
I appreciate that, Ms. Torres. conversation, Councilmember Lee.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think this might be a dumb question, but if our proposed minimum density remains at 25 and a city in the urban area, their planned density is 24, which is, one below, do they get penalized, and what is the penalty?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Lee.
Repeat the question, because I couldn't
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah, if a city in the urban area plans one number below our minimum density, do they get penalized?
You sure? Is that clear, Councilmember Bento?
I can repeat it.
Is a community panel, or do you want to repeat? the
Yeah,
question?
so the question is, if, say, for example, an urban center community has a proposed or minimum density requirement of 25, but they plan for, say, one number below it, 24, is there a penalty for that? And I will say, just kind of as a reminder, that one of the things that we do when we review comprehensive plans and amendments to them is to review for their conformance to regional system plans. And one of those conformance factors is whether or not they're meeting that minimum required density. And we also analyze whether that impact is a substantial impact or not. So we measure that test of substantial is a combination of, like, is it a lot of housing units? Is it a big difference? How much farther below? So you might remember we had also most recently had an amendment from the city of North Oaks where the staff analysis was that was a substantial impact to the regional sewer system because of how much lower it brought their minimum density down from their 3 units an acre if they were to connect that neighborhood to the system.
Ms. Torres.
Chair and committee members, I want to add on to what Lisa mentioned and just say too that when we are reviewing a comprehensive plan, we are looking across the community and not every single individual proposed development must meet that minimum of 25 units per acre. There is flexibility with how it's calculated currently, where communities can have lower density in some areas, higher density in some areas, as long as over the average of their community, of their community, that they're meeting that 25 units per acre. So it's not every parcel, every development has to meet that minimum. It is over the planning horizon, and, it will be over the decade, but, well, that's what we're proposing anyway. But it isn't every single development is over the community.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
Further discussion, Councilmember Bento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask a quick question to make sure that, I've been asked about this, and when I try to explain it, I worry that I'm maybe making more confusion than I'm clearing up. Stillwater and Hastings are both designated as suburban in both the 2040 and the 2050 maps. And Woodbury and Cottage Grove are both considered suburban edge. Is it safe for me to say, when asked about what's the difference, that part of it is that Hastings and Stillwater are communities that are closer to being fully developed and perhaps are, I don't want to say, well, older. I mean, both of them are historic cities, so.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Chair and committee member Bento, it might be helpful if I talk about the next 2 slides
Okay,
about
then
community
I want to,
designations.
Then I'll ask one more question.
Okay.
And that may come up on the next 2 slides, and I apologize for jumping to the
No,
maps.
that's just fine.
But the question came up earlier, prior to our meeting, and so I wanted to make sure. In doing this work, are we factoring in the huge water issue that exists in the East Metro area, particularly as it relates to water levels as well as to PFAS? Almost every conversation I have in the East Metro area, water comes up in a big way.
Yeah.
And the concern that I have is how much pressure can we put on communities and Mother Nature before we're guilty for a lot of the problems that we're experiencing?
Mr.
Director
Chair,
Bras?
thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento. Absolutely factoring that in, and actually at this point, more related to the allocation of growth than how dense we expect growth to be. Especially for those communities that are affected by the groundwater issues. I believe there's about 15 that are a part of that. Some I was surprised because they seem kind of far away, but they're part of that group. We have, as part of our local forecast, preliminary local forecast, have held their forecast steady because there's work underway, as you're aware, with that White Bear Lake Area Comprehensive Planning Group. So we didn't want to get ahead of that work happening. So as Angela mentioned before, and I want to emphasize again that the density requirements are not to increase growth, but to use land more efficiently. And so whether we have the same requirements as we had in Thrive or higher requirements when it comes to density doesn't change how much growth we expect that community to occur or to plan for in the coming planning horizon. And there are some ways, we didn't dig into this as much in our findings, but certainly higher density uses multifamily units tend to actually use less water per household than single family uses do, mostly because they don't have lawns. There are things you can mitigate for, but it is something that we find consistently across the region. So as we think about water use, that's part of that, thinking about how different densities can impact that, but also thinking about the thing that I was just going to tell you that completely evaporated from my brain.
Okay, that doesn't just happen.
It happens to me too, apparently. Well, if I can remember what I was thinking about, I'll share it with you. But suffice it to say, it certainly is something that we've been considering. Oh, what I was going to mention was around using land more efficiently provides us the opportunity in well-planned communities to also set much more green space aside where groundwater recharge can occur. And kind of on that point that I had shared on an earlier slide about that pressure for natural system conversion, habitat fragmentation that can happen in more dispersed types of development patterns, that certainly also has an impact on whether or not we have groundwater recharge areas that can support the use that we have on the water use side. But use certainly conservation, as we say, and even energy planning, conservation is always our first step that we should be considering regardless of our density. We have those opportunities.
Councilmember Bento.
If I could just make one final point, I just want to note that communities in the East Metro area are going through a lot as it relates to the PFAS. It's creating an enormous risk for families, people who live in those communities. It's a great concern, and folks are really anxious about it, and it's creating a huge challenge for communities financially. And yes, there's been funding from the state, but that is not easy funding to get, and it's just a lot, and it's going downstream. We have townships in southern Dakota, or excuse me, in Dakota and southern Washington that are dealing with it, and it's a nightmare.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing. I have in queue Council Members Dolkar, then Lindstrom. Councilmember Dolkar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 3 questions, and they're simple questions, mostly because I'm a little bit confused. So I'm hoping you'll help me understand it. I think there was 2 different slides. One spoke to how we're building for greater density. Like generally, we seem to be building more density, but at the same time, I think a couple of slides later, it then said, actually, we're building less, but the market demand is there for density. I think those 2 felt a little bit conflicted. I wasn't sure which one spoke to what. The second one is, I don't understand the difference between planning for the decade to the planning horizon. I'm guessing that's a very specific planner language. I'm wondering what the year difference between the 2 is. And the third question I have, again, confusion, is if I'm reading the slide, am I reading this as communities tend to plan for higher density. So for example, the urban communities on average tends to build for 30 units per acre, but our recommendation is 25. I just want to make sure I'm reading those right.
Maybe I can answer the last question first. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Dolkar, this slide, because the community designations, which are on the future slides, are not a one-for-one match, we did an analysis to see for communities that are in urban center, which we've lined up as urban, for those communities, what is the average planned density? Even though in Thrive, urban was 20 units an acre, the way that we've done Imagine 2050 community designations has different communities in that grouping. So we want to see how do they fall as a group. And that's where we have that third column of average planned density. It's for the communities that are in the Imagine 2050 urban center designation. So they're not all, that's an average across all of them. There's variation among them. Some of them are much higher than that. Some of them are a little bit lower than that. And that's why our, on the right-hand side, the proposed minimum density we're suggesting is a little bit lower than the average planned density because there's a big range among some of those groups.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Doris, the
Yes,
rest of
Chair.
has questions?
Chair and Councilmember Dolkar, I think I can address the first question that you asked, although I don't think I can rephrase it. But I think the disconnect there is that we were talking about planned densities are meeting the minimum requirements. So that's the difference between planned and developed. So we're seeing lower developed densities, but the planning, because we authorize the plans and we know that communities are consistent and in conformance with our regional system plans and policies, we know that they're planning appropriately. It's the developed densities that are not quite at the same level as the plan. So I think that's the first question.
Could I add to that
please.
too? As Angela was mentioning before, that communities have a lot of flexibility on how they plan for density. So while, let's say, 20 units an acre is your minimum, they certainly could have areas that are 10 units an acre and others that are 40. That doesn't come out to 20, but it might when you add in the total acreage that they're planning for. What we've seen in some communities is that they're developing according to their plan, but they're only maybe developing the lowest density categories that are within their comprehensive plan and not those higher ones. So in that example I just gave, they might only be doing development in that 10 units an acre category. So even though their plan looks like they've got it all, it's not the development that's actually happening is only in those lowest density categories. That's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes market crash, other things have happened in some communities, not in all communities, but we have seen that in various communities across the region where we've seen that difference.
And if I could build on what you were saying to answer the second question that you had about the decade versus horizon, we have a 20-plus year planning horizon. So 2020 to 2030, 2030 to 2040, 2040 to 2050, except that by the time we're planning that first decade, we're halfway through it. So we're looking really about a 22 to 25-year planning horizon. When we're talking about planning by decade, it is in that first decade. Where Lisa was mentioning a lot of the lower density development is happening. They're planning for, say, in urban areas, that 20 units per acre, which is Thrive right now. They're planning for that minimum density over the 2040 planning horizon, that whole time period. And what we're seeing is that in some communities, in the maybe suburban edge communities, the developing edge, they're planning for that lower density development to occur first in that first decade. And then in the second and subsequent decades, what they're planning for is for some of that higher density development to happen, which over the planning horizon does get them at that minimum density, but what we're seeing is the developed densities then coming in around that lower end. So that gets to that decadal question which you were talking about versus the planning horizon. I hope that that helps.
That did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cool, yep,
Thank
so it's a way of tracking and evaluating our progress.
Correct.
Further discussion, Councilmember Lindstrom, then Councilmember Wolf.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. You may have mentioned this, but you exclude Minneapolis in the
Yeah.
urban center, and I'm curious why that is the case, number one.
Sure.
And then number two, on slide 8, which.
Oh. Way back. Okay, my eyes
Way
can't see
back,
that.
yeah.
One more?
There you go.
There you
Yeah,
go.
so we see in that urban center, they're kind of hitting it out of the park with 52. Minimum, density minimum, 2020 through 2040. And going then back to the slide you were just at, 15. Our proposed minimum density is 25. And help me understand, like, why isn't it 30 or 40? If they're planning for 52, why isn't it way higher?
Sure.
Mr. Chair, council members, first, why did we exclude Minneapolis? Because their numbers are so much higher. They skew everything even higher. I think when we include Minneapolis in that average on the chart in the previous slide, it would have been something like 92 units an acre overall. Minneapolis also has a lot of growth, so they really pull that number up quite a bit. And same here on that planned density, has that same effect here. But if they're already doing 52, why only 25? This kind of gets to the maps that we'll show you in the upcoming slides too, that the 2040 designation isn't the same as the 2050 proposed designations. We go from 5 to 4, which means there are some communities who maybe were previously urban under the 2040 designation, who might then be combined with urban center communities under the 2050 designation. So this might help if I show you this slide. So on this map, the darkest orange is urban center, and then the next level of urban, some of those communities in the 2050 designation are together as urban in that group. And some are not. So there's some in and some out. They're not one-for-one match. So as I mentioned previously, when we did the average plan density, we took the communities from this map who are grouped together. So urban, urban edge, suburban, and looked at what their average plan densities were as a group, rather than what they were as a group under this designation. So they're different, they're not an apple to apples comparison, and it's part of the reason that we had done this analysis that you see in that third chart, was to make sure that we weren't just going up, 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 if not all communities that were hanging together in that 2050 designation weren't all in that same place.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of these things make a lot of sense to me, like the doing it by decade. But the increase of the minimum density for suburban edge, these minimum densities are of a concern to me anyway, but especially the suburban edge ones, because a lot of communities are doing what they're supposed to do and developing efficiently, but yet we're bumping up the number. Feels like punishment for the communities that are doing a good job, because of some communities that, for whatever reason, aren't meeting their density things. And some of the density stuff is dependent upon the market, and cities, even if they have land zoned for it, don't get that higher density development right away. Like Lakeville went 30 years without a market rate apartment building being built. Now they've got a bunch of them that have gone up because the market is there. But for a long time, the only people who were building multifamily were affordable developers because it had subsidies, so it didn't matter whether the dollars added up for them. Farmington's going through the same thing right now. They have their first market rate development in 30 years going up in their downtown as a redevelopment, but they had to subsidize it to get the developer to come and do it. And so you may have land available that developers just aren't interested in at those higher density ranges, because when greenfield develops, single-family happens first. And that's basically the only time it can happen is at the beginning. Because you look at the inner areas, they aren't doing any more single-family unless it's a tear down and putting a big, huge house where a tear down was. There is no new single-family in many of these designations. So if you want a single-family home, a new one, you can only get it in the suburban edge and emergent suburban edge. And if we bump that density up too much, it makes the land less affordable, because developers look at what is the land, how many units is that land listed for, and that decides how much they pay for the land. So it bumps all of the land prices up, going along with some of your discussion about restricting new areas coming in. It's going to make the land more expensive for everybody and make it harder to do single family. And we still need new single family. We thought we didn't, and then COVID happened and people realized not everybody wants to live, in a multifamily situation. And if we don't offer that option to people, they won't come here. I'm all about giving everybody choices. If you want dense and transit and all that, great, we have that for you. If you want suburban, and my suburb is very walkable. We have lots of trails and stuff. They're protecting the natural environment. And other dense development doesn't mean that you're automatically protecting nature, because Lakeville went through that for a while where we thought, okay, if we do townhouses, we'll protect trees and it'll be better. And we figured out pretty quickly that when you do a townhouse plat, the first thing you want to do is cut down every single tree and regrade the whole thing so you can get more lots in. So that protecting nature has to be a separate issue from the density. You set out where you're going to protect and you protect it, but then the other land, let it develop at what people need for choices. And I feel like we're giving up some of our choices for the region in this density thing that is coming up here.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Bento, and then Councilmember Carter.
Have we had conversations with developers about density? And where could they fit into that conversation? Because I keep thinking about the cost of building, whether it's single family or multifamily. The building costs are enormous, and are we pushing a goal that may not be feasible just from a building cost standpoint, especially given what Councilmember Wolf said about the cost of land? Just wondering if one of the unintended consequences is we may price these communities out of any ability to meet these goals.
Director Bras.
Mr. Chair, council members, certainly over the years, we have spoken with developers on before, during, and after development happens, I should say. There are times when they're asking us, how do we move and navigate through the system, what needs to come through to the council. Other times they're sharing with us, yeah, it was here, and now they pushed us down to here for density. And so, and what we see in market, in the demand for density, and especially in projects where we're funding them, is to be able to do more than what many cities are allowing for. I would offer that 4 units an acre is still single family. My house that I live on is only 4,000 square foot lot. I'm at 10 units an acre on my own. Single family can still exist at 10 units an acre. There are a variety of different ways that you can use land to still do single family housing development, and they all exist here in the metro already, and those forms, they've been proven in different areas. And certainly if land prices going up is an issue, getting more houses out of that is a good way to be able to mitigate for that cost. Keeping very low densities will only make single family more expensive to have versus using that land more efficiently.
Director Bras, and to Councilmember Bento's question about engaging the developer.
Okay, so in 2024, have we done developer engagement? I mean, we're talking post-COVID, post-change, supply chain challenges, post-significant increase in building.
Mr. Chair, council member, I don't know about 2024, I have engaged with the ULI developer. There's a group of developers within our Urban Land Institute where we've talked about these issues a couple of times since COVID. In 2024, I don't know if you've had anything to add to that as well.
It might have been late 2023, early 2024, I'm not sure, but, sorry, Chair and Councilmember Bento. When we talk, some of our LCA partners, they talk with developers all the time. Developers also call me and my team all the time as well. And I know that Hannah did an entire engagement effort, having one-on-one conversations with developers, talking, yes, about the LCA program needs and things like that, but also covering some of those other broader development trends, conversation, what's been happening, and we did an assessment of that for the RDG work as well.
Cool. Councilmember Carter.
Oh, yeah. I know that there are some complex factors related to what becomes possible for developers to market based on area characteristics of where people want to live and amenities that they're looking for. I know that I'm not aware of all of the ways in which developers calculate what makes a pro forma work, but I am really, really very glad to know that you all stay connected to those developers and that you will be able to represent when questions are asked about the kinds of requirements that we're thinking about and how they will impact those developers and their decisions to engage, because that is very important to all of our communities. And I appreciate the examples that have been given. We need to reflect on those with what developers tell us about the impacts to their performance. As I said, I am also very, very aware of the impact of units and the way on certain parcels developers will calculate their performance based on what they can get back, which is so much impacted in a lot of instances by the number of units. So I love to hear the discussion each time and to understand how the density requirements impact it. I also want to be sure that we are able to speak with our communities about how these impact their decisions and their ability to attract developers for the properties that are available there. And I want to be sure that as we think about growth and density and the different impacts that they have, that we are preparing for both single and multifamily developments. I love knowing that based on these classifications, the requirements for density are different and drastically different in a lot of ways. And also knowing that as we think about density for communities, we're not talking about density for every space, but we're talking about an overall density that results in their contribution here, but also that results in their ability to look forward to the kinds of amenities that require density. You know, if we're thinking about transportation and our plans for transportation, you know, every community wants transportation. It's so difficult sometimes to parcel out that benefit where we don't have density. So again, not on every plot or in every space do we need to think about whatever that minimum density for a community type might be, but we certainly need to think about that catalyst that is density within a community. So I'm always on this side and then on that side too, where we're talking about density. I want to just really appreciate that we're not talking about growth. You know, we're talking about density as it is combined with overall community growth. And we're not talking about individual parcels, but we're talking about how to maximize use of select parcels so that they result in that opportunity for the kinds of resources we want to share. You know, water, of course, is another one of those resources that we want to share. And I even think about paths and things of that sort, which again would be transportation. I'm sharing that thinking because I struggle with it. You know, I struggle with it very, very much. But I want to continue to remind myself and our communities of the factors you shared, you know, and that we're talking about a density that brings with it advantages. We don't always talk about the advantages that it brings because they don't come overnight, you know, but they do require that development so that we're able to justify the sharing of those resources that we all want. So thank you again for this presentation. I hear it, I've heard it a number of times. You know, a lot of the conversation here reflects much of what we've talked about in our RDG meetings, and I look forward to your talking about the minimum density in the next slides too. As I continue to hear the discussion over and over again, it continues to help me, and I hope that the repetition helps others as well.
Well, further discussion, Councilmember Wolf, and then maybe we can move into the community designation part of the presentation. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you. Historically, we have said that you need at least 3 units an acre to make the infrastructure investment work. And I'm concerned about going away from that. What's our justification? Because we have been working just fine with a minimum of 3 in terms of our overall system investment in the sewer realm. And the other investments generally come from the cities themselves. I realize there's a certain amount of investment by MnDOT and the counties on transit and whatnot, but for the developing edge, most of the roads are paid for locally, and even figuring out the density includes local roads. So it's a different calculation than when you take a parcel, say in Minneapolis, where you already have the block that the roads have all been netted out, and you're changing just the net portion of the block. In the greenfield development, all those local streets are included in your density. So if you're saying, 10 units per acre, that's not 1/10 of an acre per unit. It's less than that because of having to include the roads in that density calculation. I find it hard to sell that as that we need to do it for infrastructure when we've had 3 units per acre for as long as I can remember, and that's worked in terms of paying for the infrastructure. I was looking at the plat monitoring report from 2022 because it has individual cities in there on how they've been doing, and the ones that are low have very, very small numbers in most cases of development. They're little communities that haven't done much, and when you look at the ones that are really in the development cycle where they're getting hit hard for building developments, those are the ones that are successful in getting all of these requirements done. So it seems like we should just be working with those smaller communities, especially the ones that are in areas that don't have a housing authority that is helping them build apartments early in their development, rather than taking a heavy hand to all of the developments for the 4 units per acre.
Thank you. Councilmember Carter?
Yeah, I'm not going to purport to try to answer that. Are you kidding me? But, I continue to reflect that our planned densities have been, they have looked really, really good. But the density that we've achieved has not. I feel like there's some catch-up happening. And I asked the question too, I appreciate the question that you asked about the communities that have been successful and those that have not. We don't want to penalize, of course, communities that have been successful. As I look back, I wonder about how we're planning to, because I think that 3 acres, if we had achieved that, over time, but over a long period of time, that we've not, it might have gotten us to where we needed to be. But the fact that we've been behind maybe takes that into a different direction that now we are working to heal. So I appreciate the question that you asked and really want to understand that as much as well.
Okay, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you. I think one easy solution is for the places that aren't making it, saying that you have to get 3 units per acre for every connection, would be self-correcting for those places that are below. I think the flexibility for communities that have been doing a good job should remain there. Most of them are going with smaller lot sizes anyway to try and get affordability. Look at Rosemount, Lakeville, the ones that are doing big numbers, they're doing much smaller lots for single family. The houses are still expensive because costs are so high right now. But you still need the opportunity in some places to do bigger lots in areas where maybe you want to have executive homes or whatever, rather than having a tear down in Edina. You can have those homes in other parts of the region too.
Flexibility is very important. And I feel like there's flexibility there. But we want to continue to talk about communities that are achieving and how, in fact, to apply that flexibility, while we also want to understand what, in order for us to achieve our goals, needs to happen across the entire region. So maybe it's a matter of explaining that requirement with the designed flexibility for where the requirements are being met. And I don't know, I'm looking forward to what you all are going to say about that discussion and where we're heading.
Thank you, council members. And we are having some of the discussion that the questions key up at the end. So this is what staff was listening for. And so maybe I want to say some stuff, but I think I'm going to hold off until we get to those questions. So if we're ready to move on.
Sure.
Ready? Cool. Thanks. Please, Lisa and Angela.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. I really appreciate the discussion. I know that it's not sexy, but it is very, very important and very critical for local government, so I appreciate how thoughtful you're being in the conversation. I did want to level set just a little bit so we have an understanding of the Thrive community designations and the Imagine 2050 designations. We did do a full analysis a couple years ago now. I don't remember exactly, 2 years, yeah, okay, because it was well before the policy conversations started, where we did a full analysis of the community designations, looked at what was done in Thrive. So with community designations, there's 2 areas, urban service areas and rural service areas. Urban service areas are the ones that are within the metropolitan urban service area where they are eligible for regional sewer service, wastewater treatment. Rural service areas are outside of that MUSA area and include areas like rural centers that have their own wastewater treatment plant, as well as agricultural and other development patterns that are much bigger lots. So those 2 things. Now, when we were talking about our analysis, we only looked at change for the urban service areas. So I just want to be clear about that. We're not talking about agricultural, diversified rural, rural residential, or rural center areas being changed at all. Those were considered good to go. No changes there. With Thrive, there was a different set of analysis behind that. They looked at as far as how community designations were determined. They looked at the MUSA. They looked at percentage of developable land committed to urban uses, the age of housing stock, which was a proxy for the age of infrastructure and kind of the general development pattern. They looked at intersection density, which really indicates connectivity, urban form, and accessibility, and they looked at the long-term wastewater service area. When we were looking at Imagine 2050, we did do that same analysis between urban service area and rural service area. As Lisa has mentioned, they're recommending only 4 urban service area community designations: urban, urban edge, suburban, and suburban edge, which actually simplifies it quite a lot, which is nice. The community designations analysis were really based on 4 factors, again, looking at the MUSA, as well as the age of housing stock and the intersection density. But instead of looking at the percentage of developable land committed to urban uses, they looked at the planned residential density in the local comprehensive plans. So as a reminder, this was done from scratch, so we didn't build off of Thrive. We started from scratch and built up to what community designation, what is the pattern in different communities, where are the similarities, where are communities alike, and that kind of is represented in this map now. So I want to also say that now that we have proposed numbers for densities, we will do some right sizing. We know that some communities went from emerging suburban edge to suburban, so we don't want communities going from a minimum of 3 to a minimum of 7. So we'll do some right sizing, we'll do some manual adjustments and adjust some of the community designations so that we're kind of level setting based on the new analysis. But we also look for adjustments as just a course of our work. We adjust community designations over time. We do that when system statements are distributed. We do that during the comprehensive plan update process. And obviously, we talked about it with communities when we did the analysis initially. So there are many points along the way through the public comment period that we'll also be talking with communities about their 2050 community designation. But these designations were endorsed by the council in March of 2023. So that analysis must have been in 21. So I'll walk through, we talked about the first proposed policy recommendation. We have a few more, so we'll talk about those. The next one is to establish criteria for MUSA expansions. So really thinking about restraining MUSA expansion for when it meets specific criteria. Not that MUSA can't be expanded, but right now the kind of default is, does the system have capacity? Well, I think a little bit more refinement in that criteria is well warranted. And in fact, we used to have criteria in previous planning cycles. I think it was just in Thrive, it wasn't carried forward, but we have had that in the past, and we're looking at bringing that forward again. I do want to note too that when we're talking about the Metropolitan Urban Service Area, we're really talking about land supply within that MUSA boundary. And we know through our very smart research folks that have shared with me that the existing MUSA has more than adequate land supply, not only to accommodate the forecasted growth to 2050, but enough land supply out well past 2100. So 2100, I think it's actually 2170, where there's enough land to supply within the existing MUSA without expansion to accommodate regional growth for quite a while. So with that, I just want to say that we can walk through some of the things that the density report talks about, really thinking about signaling a commitment to efficient and cost-effective growth management, encouraging efficient infrastructure utilization, and directing development to areas already equipped with infrastructure. When we're talking about compact development, I know that I say this all the time, I want to say it again, compact development happens in every community across the region. It happens in the city of Belle Plaine, it happens in Eagan, it happens in Stillwater, it happens in Hugo, it happens in Minneapolis. So it happens across the region, it looks differently. Where existing infrastructure is, it just looks different in different communities, as is normal. All communities are very unique. And so I'll pause to see if there's any questions about the proposal to establish some criteria for MUSA expansion, or I can continue through the next slides.
Questions at this point? Councilmember Wolf?
Is the land analysis taking into account people who own large tracts of land that are not willing to develop it? For example, there's one in Lakeville that was supposed to be the area of most of their growth for the next 20 years that said, nope.
Ms. Torres?
Well, yes, it does. We know that that happens, and we're talking about planning, and so we're not talking about when the development is going to happen. We're talking about accommodating it within the time period where we think that might happen. Property owners change their minds all the time. Redevelopment is part of this as well. It's not just greenfield development, and that's taken into consideration with similar to our forecast analysis is based on an economic model, land use model. So I don't know, real estate model. Thank you for that one. So it does take into some of those things into its considerations. Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Dolker?
I'm going to ask this question, and I'm not sure if I fully understand the question myself. So, starting with the place of confusion. So, just to repeat back what I think, what I'm hearing is that the council always had a policy around MUSA expansion that wasn't carried into 2040 Thrive Plan. And so our default ended up being, can the system hold additional development? And so we went that way. And now you're bringing back this additional criteria as a way to evaluate if additional densities should be done based, and that also explains, could MUSA be expanded? Because I feel like that's been an issue that has come up. Yeah. I'm not sure what I'm asking for. As I can tell.
I think I get you, Mr. Chair, Councilmember. The council used to have a series of MUSA expansion policies that were very based on available land supply over a 20-year rolling land supply basis. Do we have enough land to support our forecasted growth for the next 20 years? There were some proposals, this was, and there were a couple of iterations of this in the mid-90s and early 2000s. Excuse me, as soon as I talk, I have to cough. In the, ultimately what was adopted as part of the regional development framework and then in Thrive was, did not consider that 20-year land supply issue. In documentation from the 90s and early 2000s, prior to the 2030 regional development framework, around requests for MUSA expansion, there was a more rigorous analysis of how much land is needed in this community for their forecasted growth, how much are they asking for, how much supply would that give them, and then is there more needed in this region? What do surrounding communities in this market area have for land supply? Do we need to add more here? What are the development trends in this area? Not just do we have sufficient capacity in our wastewater system to accommodate that request, but rather on the land efficiency side, do we actually need more land right now for what is asked, and is the amount of land that is being requested as an addition to the system the right amount or too much? Once land is in the system, then we're planning, or within the MUSA, then we're planning to support that land through our wastewater investments for its within the planning horizon that ultimately is shared with us through local planning, that they plan to connect and development will occur within, our 20-year planning horizon. That means we're making investments, capital investments to support that. But if it's too much land, are we prematurely making capital investments that aren't going to be used for decades to come? So that's the bigger question, and why we really want to think about bringing back some of those criteria, revisiting criteria that are more rigorous around, do we need more land right now to support that regionally, within that market, within this community? Because it does have an impact on our capital investments in the region.
Okay. Okay, that was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on, please.
we'll move to the next one. This is the one I said, we'll revisit it again later, and now is the time. So one of the original recommendations, a policy decision, and I think that I have heard guidance from council members. I would like for a confirmation of that here tonight, if possible. The recommendation was originally under consideration to require minimum densities for all new connections to the regional system. So a minimum density that's reflective of the community designation for any new development connecting to the sewer system. We thought originally that this would encourage higher density, more compact development, promote efficient platting practices. It would really streamline our sewer permit review, by the way, which we do run across some challenges with. But what we have found through conversation and through additional consideration is that there will be some real significant challenges to implementation of this. Communities have many different ranges for different land use categories. Right now, communities are able to, as I've mentioned in previous parts of our conversation, plan for some low density here, higher density here, and then it averages out to the minimum density overall. If we were to require all new connections to be at a minimum density that is higher than the range that they might have existing right now, lower density, say 2 units an acre. We have a lot of the developing edge communities that have land use categories for single-family residential that are perhaps like 2 to 5 units per acre. Generally, they do develop somewhere along that midpoint, but they do allow much lower densities. If we were to require that all new connections to the sewer system meet that minimum for the community designation, that would mean, as it's proposed right now, all new connections would have to be at 4 units per acre, 7 units per acre, 14 units per acre, or 25 units per acre. We could just do that in the developing area. It doesn't have to be across all community designations, but I still think that we would be almost at cross purposes with ourselves if we were to propose this. And so hearing concerns from council members in the RDG working group, I would suggest that what I have heard is that this no longer move forward as a recommendation. We did hear that too at the most recent conversation with the Regional Planning Advisory Group. They're like, please don't move this one forward. And so I would pose that as a change in the recommendations, but I wanted to propose it today on the slide as it was in the original staff, or in the original density report, so that there wasn't confusion. We're pulling it out. Why aren't we talking about that one? But I wanted to bring that conversation forward here.
Thank you. Discussion? Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned before, in lieu of increasing densities on everybody, having this policy only for communities that are below the minimum of 3 seems to me to be a kinder solution to get them back up. And I wouldn't go all the way back to the beginning of the plat monitoring program in terms of figuring them out. I'd be looking at what they have been doing lately, and if they're still falling below, that would be a way to get them up without penalizing all of the other communities. And we didn't really talk about, do all communities have enough capacity in their sewer system for these increased densities? I know the pipe that my house goes to is getting very close to full. And expanding those can be very expensive too. Just popped into my head and thought I better say it before I forget again.
Other comments? I mean, to that last point, Councilman Wolf, I appreciate you bringing it up, and you have in the past, and so I appreciate the consistency. But also some of these, this is where I kind of struggle, and I don't know that I'm gonna, I don't say struggle, but I ponder, and I don't know if I'm gonna get there tonight. But when local communities make certain decisions about how they're sewering their development at whatever density, and then there may be growth, or well, there's likely to be growth, and then that puts the pressure on the capacity. Again, a point that you bring up, and I appreciate. then that becomes a question, a regional question, right? Suddenly it's about our regional capacity. And so, to respect those local communities to make their local decisions, but then there are sort of tails on those decisions that really become a cost to the region. And kind of to your example earlier about the roads and, the local communities might build the roads, but that doesn't mean the local communities are gonna always be responsible for the maintenance, the safety, the expansion of those roads. So a local community, this is to me where this is kind of the nub of density requirements. That we need to come to a point where we can say, okay, at this density, if it's 4 units per acre, then there's an acknowledgement that there may be shifts of the cost burden from a local community to a regional entity. And so that's what I'm trying to understand. And I think, this, the minimum density, the requirements for connections, in my opinion, needs to be defined somehow. I mean, you just put another formula down, Councilmember Wolf, that could define it, but you bring this up a lot, that there are these communities that are self-sewering right now that maybe aren't going to be able to do that in perpetuity. And then that becomes our problem, right? And so how are we planning to face these eventualities now? I mean, that's our job, right? We're the planning agency. So that's kind of that's where my thinking is at the moment. So I know I'm not giving you any direction at all. I'm just sort of bringing more, issues to the forefront. Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
So I'm trying to understand what you're talking about in terms of roads becoming somebody else's responsibility, because I've not seen that happen. I've seen MnDOT say, we don't have the budget, it's not gonna happen. And so the cities and the counties are paying for the roads in my district, in Sue's district, that would be covered in other parts of the metro.
Right.
And you can't accommodate really big densities because you don't have that trunk highway network to deal with the big traffic. I mean, there's between Highway 13 in Burnsville and Northfield, there are no east-west state highways. That's all covered by city and county.
Or not, right? Or the work isn't done. The road
so-
doesn't become safer. The
Right.
bridge doesn't get replaced.
So to accommodate high density, when the state has said, we're not paying for the roads ever. I mean, there is no plan for a east-west state highway between Highway 13 and Highway 19 down in Northfield. So you can't accommodate high densities without that network of state highways, freeways to accommodate the traffic that is going to happen from those people.
Thank you. Further comment? All right, I think we're ready to continue.
I would propose that we talk about this one further in the RDG working group, just to provide a little bit more direction from council members, based on the proposal that Councilmember
I'll
Wolf
look to the chair of the
has
group,
suggested.
Councilmember Carter.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
We knew that needed work, right?
Yes.
Right.
And I would be happy to join you guys if I'm allowed.
Lovely. Guest speaker.
I don't have any control over that, full disclosure. Okay. The next one is another policy recommendation to really evaluate the feasibility of demand and development of land uses based on practicality. This really is about ensuring that both the intensity, like the density range, and the location of planned developments are practical. It differentiates between what's allowable and what's plausible, and it provides a realistic framework for land use planning. What we see on occasion, not across the board, is that in an effort to show that a community is accommodating forecasted growth, while still maintaining their preferred development pattern, perhaps of really low density development, they will impractically guide to a really high density in one particular area of a community. I've seen that in comprehensive plans. And so this is just really to reflect what we know as far as development trends. This would be a quantitative measure, something we would work on developing a methodology with our research partners on, and really ensure that we're looking at a practical approach to land use planning.
Make sense?
Mr. Chair, if,
Councilmember Wolf?
I've seen communities play games with their zoning where it's impossible to build what they said you could build. And so having those match up is appropriate,
Thank you.
as close as possible. I mean, you can't analyze it to death, but if there's a gross difference between what it says in zoning and what it says in the comp plan, that's appropriate to
Okay. Thank you.
call a foul.
Offer here too, Mr. Chair and council members, that sometimes we see a community who has planned for low densities, let's say 3 to 5, 5 to 6, kind of stay within that 10 units an acre range. And then they have some lower, very low density that they want to accommodate. So in order to accommodate that, they guide something somewhere else, say at 40 units an acre. Like, so you jump from 10 to 40 with nothing in between. Like, that doesn't seem practical, and you don't have any development pattern to show that you're doing anything close to barely 3, let alone 40 or 30. So those are some of the things that we'll be working on. How do we define like what it means to be practical when we see these big gaps that sometimes just come in through an amendment process because they see something else come in, so that we're actually not playing games with the numbers, but are actually promoting development patterns that are likely to occur within a community too.
Further discussion, Councilmember Carter?
And just to add, that's also an area where we are discussing the potential of flexibility based on performance. So, which works better, the carrot or the stick? And that may help us to find that.
Okay, I'll move to the next slide, Chair.
Yep, please.
So we're moving into the administrative practices and guidelines section of the recommendations, and this is really getting to the how we implement policy. So these are internal analysis practices on how we calculate density, the things that we consider as part of a calculation or not. And so we'll talk a little bit about a couple of different practices and guidelines that will help to support regional goals and new policy. So the first one is to include all land guided to support growth. So current council policy gives deference to the previously council authorized and locally approved comprehensive plan, and only reviews for densities in the new plan based on areas of change between the two planning documents. So this can really lead to an authorized plan that doesn't meet minimum density requirements if we're only considering areas of change, and it can hinder the region in being effective in addressing changing needs and conditions and advancing regional goals. So density calculations including all area guided to support their forecasted growth within the planning period, not just areas of change. Right now, we just look at new development and redevelopment areas that the city, any community identifies, this is the area where we're going to support this much growth, and overall, those 3 little areas that they're planning for accommodate their forecast for that planning period. And we're looking at just kind of looking at the community as a whole. Where are you guiding land to support your forecasted growth, whether it existed in the 2040 plan or not, and kind of taking a blank slate to that. A lot of communities do that. Some of them are like, no, we're just looking at the whole community differently in this planning period, and they start from scratch. A lot of communities do that. We have a few communities that just look at areas of change because that's been the requirement, so it's been completely appropriate, but we're thinking that a broader perspective might be well warranted.
Thank you. This makes sense. Councilmember Wolf?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This one, to me, helps communities that have guided land for apartments that haven't been built. Instead of having to guide another piece of land for apartments and sort of undermine the market for the one that's waiting to be built, we need to acknowledge, because if they're allowing it, they've got the land and everything, and the market just isn't there, we shouldn't be saying, okay, now go do another one. That was my thought on this.
I agree, and I think it also goes to what I think it was Angela said earlier, you know, we're not, or maybe it was Lisa, but it respects more the pattern of development and growth within individual communities, right? I mean, to me, this makes sense. And practically speaking, I don't know that it means go back to the drawing board and start from scratch every comprehensive planning cycle, but you can look at your growth areas, but then calculate it within a bigger context. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. I think it sounds more collaborative, sort of cooperative, and acknowledging the different designations. So, local authority. Cool. Anything else on this slide? All right, let's move on, please.
The next is also an administrative practice and guideline identifying forecasted growth in land supply by decade. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but meeting those density requirements within each planning decade rather than over the 20-year planning horizon. Local comp plans already identify stages or phases of growth in 10-year increments, but the council's standard has been to review density in aggregate across the planning horizon. We're talking about doing that and meeting those density requirements in every 10-year planning period. The communities that are allocated affordable housing need already do this in that first decade, and so this just carries forward a practice already established into the full planning process, not just as it relates to affordable housing.
Well, makes sense. We had some discussion about this earlier. Any further discussion? All right. Please continue.
And this is the one that a lot of people like to talk about. We're talking about flexibility. We are talking about how we would do this with local governments. We think that's very important, but we want to explore approaches to flexibility while advancing regional goals. So we are thinking about applying a performance-based approach, which we haven't done before. We have always applied flexibility universally, even if communities weren't reaching goals or achieving consistency in all areas, flexibility was still provided across the board. And so switching to a performance-based kind of programmatic approach to applying density really rewards communities that are doing good planning, achieving goals, and supporting regional policies. Hopefully, this will encourage communities to ensure consistency and improve performance to ensure that flexibility doesn't exacerbate local planning challenges.
Comments, discussion? I think this is interesting, programmatizing this, and to me, this is the place where where we could better identify and support individual communities' needs. If we're gonna create a performance-based approach, then we need to make sure that every community has the capacity to participate in a performance-based approach. And we've had a lot of discussion on this committee and on this council about how we bring support, not just to the comprehensive planning process, but no, this is to the implementation of it, right? And to me, this is starting to build that pipeline. And I think that's really exciting. Yeah, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In theory, this looks good. I need to see the details to
Right.
decide whether it really is.
But it's different, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we need to put some meat on the bones here.
Yes, Chair and committee members, this would be one of those pieces where we would work directly with local governments to find out where their needs are, what kinds of flexibility is necessary. I think that will, so I won't be able to answer Councilmember Wolf's question in any short order because that takes time to do. But what I would say is that most communities really like flexibility. They ask for flexibility. This will help us focus on communities that are doing well, but our support for communities that are struggling can be more focused, and so that we're able to provide more assistance to communities that need it, more so than communities that are doing really great planning already.
Right, I think that makes a lot of sense. Further discussion on that? Let's
sorry.
move on. No, let's do it.
Sorry.
We're charging ahead.
I was hearing none, so I'm so sorry, Chair. In the density report itself, you'll notice that there were a couple of approaches that we didn't include on things that we should move forward on. One was including all existing development in density calculations. That's taking the entire existing developed land into consideration in density calculations. That would really penalize local governments for past planning practices. And while it impacts the current development pattern, we don't want to penalize communities for doing that. It would almost shift the entire way we calculated density and had our entire density approach. And so we really don't think that that's a good practice, and so we weren't recommending it, although we wanted to investigate it because it was something that was on it. We tried to provide a full menu of things that we needed to investigate. We just don't think that it's probably the best approach for local governments.
Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would just point out that those density numbers that we have for the different land uses were never designed to be the minimum density for the entire community. It was directed towards redevelop, what density do you need to make redevelopment feasible rather than that the whole community was supposed to be at those densities.
Thank you. Councilmember Bento, you look like you were just on the verge of saying something. Oh, okay, we're
Sorry.
almost to the end.
Almost there. The other thing that we are not recommending to move forward is to establish target densities in addition to minimum densities. We did this in the TOD areas in the 2040 plan and found that communities largely were planning towards the minimum densities. They didn't take into consideration a density target. And so the work to create that and build that and implement that, just we didn't see kind of that return on investment as a worthwhile effort for that. So we were proposing, seeing that it didn't do anything in the previous round, not to move that forward either.
If I can just pause for a second, because it looks like we're going to lose Councilmember Bento. I guess you have to leave. I just wanted to note that the Vice Chair, Councilmember Bento, and I were approached by Councilmember Cedarburg with some questions. You brought up some
Yep.
specifics.
That was the question I
Yeah.
asked about the urban.
Yeah,
Yep,
and I
correct.
appreciate that. And then you touched on a couple of Councilmember Cedarburg's questions, and Lisa assures me that they'll follow up
Yeah.
with Councilmember
Yep.
Cedarburg to make sure that all of her points, because she's listening, so I
Yes.
wanted to hear, I wanted her to hear me say that. So
Thank
cool.
you.
Thank you.
Yes. I just want to emphasize that partnership is key. We can help local governments adapt to some changes in our density policy. We always do that in every planning cycle. We would just target that assistance towards any changes, honestly, in policy that will come out of Imagine 2050. But we're looking at things differently. We're looking at how we can better support local planning. We want communities to be successful, and we recognize that tools and resources are an important piece in that. We do need help from local governments as well. There's a lot of pieces that I mentioned that would be where we would need to collaborate with them to develop more specificity around flexibility and performance measures and other things. Music criteria, we would run through some of our local planning groups that we have established as well. So there's some, as well as LUAC, we have a couple of things that we're talking about with LUAC as well. So we definitely need help from local governments to solidify and plan on some of these things. We have talked throughout, so I don't know if you want me to pause for any final discussion.
We have had some rich discussion, I feel.
I got all mine out.
The one thing, I'm really intrigued by Councilmember Wolf's point about the density calculations, including, and the relationship to new infrastructure, a road. Is that included in the calculation? Is it not? And I don't need an answer right now, but I just thought that was a really intriguing question.
Okay. We do have some engagement planned on this. As we mentioned earlier, last Tuesday, we had a meeting with the Metro Cities Regional Planning Advisory Group that we have had. It's been up and running maybe almost 2 years now. In addition to the forecast engagement that's still ongoing, we have 2 virtual specific density conversations planned. I did send an email out on Friday. Council members are certainly welcome to attend. Please let your community relations specialist know if you're planning on attending so we can monitor quorum issues. If we need to, we will just simply notice the meeting, but I want you to know that you are certainly welcome to attend and observe.
Cool.
Anything there? Okay. Next steps, still more work, still more work. The density analysis report and recommendations will be updated based on further direction. We have a TOD analysis and recommendations that we will have, that have specific density numbers there as well. The methodology for the feasibility of demand and development of land uses based on practicality will be under development, criteria for MUSA expansion, and the criteria for performance-based flexibility are all things that will need to be ongoing work with local governments. There, we're done.
Great, excellent.
We'll end there.
So okay. One of the pieces on that last slide, Angela, you hit on it but is the support for local governments. And is that in there somewhere? And I'm just.
Oh, well, as Chair and committee members, I guess I don't mention that because we do.
Right? And
Sorry?
So we're looking to, it used to be the grant program. for
Oh, we'll have
assist-
that as well.
Right, but I mean,
That's-
yeah, okay.
That's I guess, a separate thing, not specifically related to density, because the Planning Assistance
I
Grant
see.
Fund
Okay,
applies to comprehensive plans at large,
Great.
so
Alright.
that is a different form of
Okay,
assistance.
sounds good. Okay. Committee members, anything? Thank you, great work. I appreciate
so
your
much.
hanging with us. Committee members, I appreciate us getting through all of this in one sitting. Look forward to the next iteration.
Thank you so much. guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle, anything?
No, I do not have anything.
Okay, I think this is our only official council meeting of the week, isn't it? Of the holiday week, so enjoy your holiday, everyone. Have a lovely and safe time off. And seeing no further business before us, we're adjourned.
Sitting next to you.